The body had been in the freezer for 3 weeks. When I opened it on March 14th, 2009, the temperature logs showed it had been functioning perfectly the entire time. Someone had deliberately preserved the evidence. The flesh was firm, almost crystalline under the industrial lights of the storage facility. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the preservation itself. It was the surgical precision of the incisions along the victim's torso. These weren't defensive wounds. These were exploratory cuts, made while the victim was still alive. I'm a forensic pathologist, and I've seen things that would make most people lose sleep for years. But nothing prepared me for what I found in that freezer in the basement of Moose Jaw General Hospital. The victim's medical chart listed cause of death as acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack, natural causes, case closed. Except the heart was missing entirely, removed with the kind of expertise that takes years of surgical training to master. Her name was Rebecca Thornhill, and she deserved so much better than what happened to her. She was a 34-year-old high school biology teacher, beloved by her students, known for her infectious laugh and her habit of bringing homemade cookies to parent-teacher conferences. She coached the girls' volleyball team and volunteered at the local animal shelter every Saturday morning. Her husband, James, was a mechanic who worked at the Ford dealership on Manitoba Street. They had 2 daughters, Emma and Sophie, ages 7 and 5. Rebecca was training for her first half marathon. She had her whole life mapped out. On February 19th, 2009, at approximately 7:23 p.m., Rebecca checked herself into the emergency department, complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath. The triage nurse, Patricia Dumont, recorded her vital signs. Blood pressure, 138/84, heart rate 92 beats per minute, respiratory rate 18, oxygen saturation 97% on room air. Nothing immediately alarming, but enough to warrant further investigation. Dr. Malcolm Rutherford was the attending physician that night. He ordered an EKG and basic blood work. Rebecca was placed in examination room 3, the one at the end of the hallway with the flickering fluorescent light that maintenance never got around to fixing. At 8:47 p.m., Rebecca's husband arrived at the hospital. He told the nurse at the desk that his wife had called him sounding frightened, saying the doctors wanted to keep her overnight for observation. But when I later reviewed the medical records, there was no documentation of any such decision. No admission orders, no overnight observation protocol initiated, just a gap in the timeline that nobody could adequately explain. At 11:43 p.m., a code blue was called for examination room 3. Rebecca Thornhill was found unresponsive. No pulse, no respirations. The resuscitation team worked on her for 47 minutes. Dr. Rutherford pronounced her dead at 12:30 a.m. on February 20th. Time of death officially recorded. Cause listed as cardiac arrest secondary to acute myocardial infarction. Her body was tagged and sent to the hospital morgue. A routine autopsy was scheduled for the following week, standard procedure for any unexpected death in a hospital setting. But the autopsy never happened, at least not the official one. When I arrived at the morgue on March 14th to perform what I thought would be a straightforward post-mortem examination, I found Rebecca's body in that freezer, already cut open, organs removed, and then inexpertly sewn back together. The sutures were crude, the kind a first-year medical student might make, not the precise work of a trained pathologist. Someone had performed an unauthorized autopsy and then tried to cover their tracks. I immediately contacted the hospital administration. Dr. Gerald Ashworth, the chief of staff, seemed genuinely shocked. He claimed to have no knowledge of any autopsy being performed on Rebecca Thornhill. He promised a full internal investigation. That investigation lasted exactly 4 days before it was quietly shut down. I was told that the matter had been resolved internally and that I should complete my examination and file my report. No further questions necessary. But I had questions. So many questions. Why was Rebecca's heart missing? Who performed the unauthorized autopsy? What were they looking for? And most disturbing of all, what had they found? I began my own investigation. I pulled Rebecca's complete medical history from the hospital database. She had been a patient at Moose Jaw General for years, routine checkups, nothing unusual, but then I noticed something odd. She spent 3 days in the hospital, underwent numerous tests, and was discharged with a diagnosis of acute gastroenteritis. Standard stuff. Except the attending physician for that admission was Dr. Malcolm Rutherford, the same doctor who was on duty the night she died. I contacted Rebecca's primary care physician, Dr. Helena Novak, who had a small practice on Main Street. Dr. Novak was genuinely distressed when I told her about Rebecca's death. She had no idea. Nobody from the hospital had notified her, which was highly unusual. When I asked about Rebecca's August hospitalization, Dr. Novak's expression changed. She told me that Rebecca had come to see her 2 weeks after that hospital stay, complaining of persistent fatigue and unexplained weight loss. Dr. Novak had ordered blood work, and the results showed elevated liver enzymes and abnormal kidney function. She had referred Rebecca back to the hospital for further testing, but Rebecca never followed up. She seemed frightened, Dr. Novak said. She didn't want to go back to that hospital. I spent the next 3 weeks piecing together what I could from hospital records, talking to nurses who had worked that night, interviewing anyone who had contact with Rebecca during her final hours. What I discovered was a pattern of negligence so egregious, so systematic, that it could only be intentional. 0. Hyperkalemia. At that level causes cardiac arrest, but here's the thing. That blood work was never included in her official medical chart. I only found it because a lab technician named David Chen had kept a duplicate copy as part of his personal quality control records. I confronted Dr. Rutherford. He claimed to have no memory of treating Rebecca Thornhill, despite his name being all over her medical records. When I pressed him about the missing blood work results, he became defensive, then hostile. He told me I was overstepping my bounds, that I should focus on my job and leave the clinical decisions to the attending physicians. 2 days later, I was called into Dr. Ashworth's office and informed that my contract with the hospital was being terminated, effective immediately. My 23-year career ended with a single phone call, but I couldn't let it go. I took my findings to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment in Moose Jaw. Detective Sergeant Thomas Brennan seemed interested at first. He took my statement, collected copies of the documents I had managed to obtain before being locked out of the hospital systems. He promised a thorough investigation. 3 months later, I received a letter from the RCMP stating that they had found no evidence of criminal wrongdoing in Rebecca Thornhill's death. Case closed. I tried the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Saskatchewan. Surely they would be concerned about a doctor potentially poisoning a patient and then covering it up. I filed a formal complaint against Dr. Rutherford, providing all the evidence I had collected. Dr. Rutherford was cleared of any wrongdoing. I couldn't get it out of my mind. What had happened during those missing hours between 8:47 p.m. and 11:43 p.m.? I obtained visitor logs from the hospital security office through a contact who still worked there. On the night Rebecca died, there were 3 visitors logged into the examination room area who had no official business being there. Dr. Rutherford, obviously, but also 2 other individuals whose names made my stomach drop. Marcus Pemberton, CEO of Pemberton Pharmaceuticals, a company based in Regina that had been conducting clinical trials at Moose Jaw General for the past 2 years. And Dr. Vivian Zhang, Director of Research and Development for the same company. I started digging into Pemberton Pharmaceuticals. What I found was deeply disturbing. The company was developing a new cardiac medication called Cardiotex, designed to prevent heart attacks in high-risk patients. They were in Phase 3 clinical trials, the final stage before seeking FDA approval. Success would mean billions in revenue. But there had been problems. 3 patients in the clinical trial had died unexpectedly during the testing phase at other hospitals across Canada. The deaths had been attributed to pre-existing conditions, and the trials had been allowed to continue. I managed to obtain a list of clinical trial participants at Moose Jaw General through a former colleague who still had access to the research database. Rebecca Thornhill's name was on that list. She had been receiving the experimental medication for 6 months before her death. And based on the toxic potassium levels in her blood, I believe the medication was causing fatal electrolyte imbalances that the company was desperately trying to hide. The unauthorized autopsy, the missing heart, the destroyed evidence. It all made horrific sense. Someone was removing the organs that would show traces of the experimental drug. Someone was making sure that Rebecca Thornhill's death could never be definitively linked to Cardiotex. And based on the visitor logs showing Pemberton executives in the hospital that night, I believe they were present during Rebecca's final hours, possibly even administering the lethal dose themselves. I took this information to the local media. The Moose Jaw Times-Herald wouldn't touch it. Too controversial, they said. Potential legal liability. I contacted CBC News, CTV, Global. Nobody was interested in the story of a small-town teacher who died in a hospital. Nobody wanted to go up against a pharmaceutical company with deep pockets and powerful lawyers. I tried filing a wrongful death lawsuit on behalf of Rebecca's family, connecting them with a lawyer in Regina who specialized in medical malpractice. The lawyer was initially enthusiastic, but after reviewing the case for 2 weeks, he called to tell me he couldn't take it. He wouldn't say why, but I could hear the fear in his voice. Someone had gotten to him. My life fell apart systematically after that. I couldn't find work anywhere in Saskatchewan. My wife, Jennifer, left me after 26 years of marriage. She said I had become obsessed, that I was throwing away everything we had built for a conspiracy theory that nobody believed. My daughter, Amanda, stopped returning my calls. I lost my house, my savings, everything. I'm living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Regina now, working as a part-time consultant for a private autopsy service. I'm still looking for evidence, still trying to find someone who will listen, because Rebecca Thornhill wasn't the only victim. I've identified 4 other patients who died at Moose Jaw General while enrolled in the Cardiotex clinical trial. 4 other families who were told their loved ones died of natural causes. 4 other suspicious deaths that were never properly investigated. Pemberton Pharmaceuticals received FDA approval for Cardiotex in November 2011. The medication is now prescribed to hundreds of thousands of patients across North America. The company's stock price tripled. Marcus Pemberton was featured in Fortune magazine as one of Canada's most innovative healthcare entrepreneurs. Dr. Malcolm Rutherford is now the Chief of Cardiology at Regina General Hospital, one of the most prestigious positions in the province. Dr. Vivian Zhang received a Governor General's Innovation Award for her work in cardiac care. Her daughters are teenagers now, growing up without their mother. Her husband remarried 3 years after her death. Life went on for everyone except Rebecca. If you worked at Moose Jaw General Hospital between 2008 and 2009, if you were involved in the Cardiotex clinical trials, if you know anything about what really happened to Rebecca Thornhill, please come forward. She deserves justice. Her family deserves the truth. And the thousands of patients taking Cardiotex deserve to know what was done to ensure that medication made it to market. Some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried. This is one of them. I found them on October 3, 2003, 18 years after they were supposed to have been incinerated. 27 Polaroids of Indigenous children, ages ranging from approximately 4 to 14, standing against a white wall with numbers pinned to their clothing like prisoners in a booking photo. The date stamps on the backs of the photos read July through September 1978. None of these children were ever seen again. I worked as a social worker for Manitoba Child and Family Services, assigned to the northern region covering Churchill and the surrounding Indigenous communities. My job was supposed to be about protecting vulnerable children, keeping families together when possible, finding safe placements when necessary. What I discovered instead was a systematic program of child trafficking, operating with the full knowledge and cooperation of government officials, local police, and the medical establishment The children in those photographs had names, families, communities that loved them. Alana Kunuk was 7 years old, from Arviat. She loved to draw pictures of polar bears and dream of becoming a veterinarian. Her grandmother, Martha, had raised her after Alana's mother died in childbirth. When social workers came to take Alana on July 12, 1978, claiming Martha was too old to provide adequate care, Martha fought them. She was arrested for assault and spent 3 days in jail. By the time she was released, Alana was gone. The official records stated she had been placed with a foster family in Winnipeg. No names, no address, no follow-up documentation. Samuel Nanook was 12, from Rankin Inlet. He was the oldest of 6 siblings, responsible and mature beyond his years. He helped his father with the fishing nets, translated for his grandmother at medical appointments, looked after his younger brothers and sisters with the kind of gentle patience that made everyone in the community respect him. On August 3, 1978, Samuel was taken from school by 2 social workers who claimed there had been reports of neglect in the home. His father, Joseph, immediately went to the social services office to contest the removal. He was told that the matter was under investigation and that Samuel would be returned once the home environment was deemed suitable. Samuel never came home. There are no records of what happened to him after September 15, 1978. Little Nayak Ipili was only 5 years old when she disappeared. She was taken from her home in Whale Cove on September 21, 1978, after a public health nurse reported suspicious bruising on her arms. The bruises were from playing, rough housing with her cousins, the kind of minor marks every active child accumulates. But the nurse, Catherine Whitmore, had been filing reports on Nayak's family for months, documenting every perceived inadequacy, the small size of their home, the fact that Nayak sometimes wore the same clothes 2 days in a row, the concerning amount of traditional food in their diet instead of proper nutrition from the store. The family couldn't afford the store prices. They lived the way their ancestors had lived for thousands of years, hunting and fishing and sharing resources within the community. But to Catherine Whitmore, this was evidence of poverty and neglect. I found the photographs while looking for case files on a completely different matter. I had been assigned to follow up on a 16-year-old girl who had aged out of the foster care system and was now homeless in Winnipeg. While searching for her intake paperwork, I stumbled across that envelope in a drawer that should have been empty. The moment I saw those photographs, I knew I was looking at something monstrous. I started cross-referencing the numbers on the children's clothing with old case files stored in the archives. It took me 3 months of after-hours research, coming into the office late at night when nobody else was around, copying documents that I wasn't supposed to access. What I discovered was a coordinated program of child removal that specifically targeted Indigenous families in remote northern communities. Between 1975 and 1982, over 400 children were taken from their families in the Churchill area alone. The official justification was always the same: neglect, inadequate housing, parental substance abuse, domestic violence. But when I read through the actual case notes, the evidence was flimsy at best, fabricated at worst. The pattern was consistent. A public health nurse or teacher would file a report expressing concerns about a child's welfare. Within days, social workers would arrive to remove the child, often without a court order, sometimes in the middle of the night. Parents were told the placement was temporary, that they could get their children back if they completed certain requirements: attend parenting classes, maintain stable housing, submit to regular home inspections. But the requirements kept changing, the goalposts constantly moving, and the children never came home. I tracked down some of the families whose children had been taken decades earlier. Martha Kunuk was still alive, living in a small apartment in Arviat. She was 83 years old, her hands twisted with arthritis, her eyes clouded with cataracts. But her memory of the day they took Alana was perfectly clear. She described the social workers as cold, efficient, indifferent to her pleas. She had spent years trying to find her granddaughter, writing letters to every government agency she could think of, hiring a lawyer she couldn't afford who took her money and did nothing. She never stopped looking. She showed me a drawer full of Alana's drawings, carefully preserved. The colors faded, but the images still visible. Polar bears, always polar bears. Martha died 6 months after I met her, still not knowing what happened to her granddaughter. Joseph Nanook was harder to find. He had moved away from Rankin Inlet years earlier, unable to bear the constant reminders of his lost son. I finally located him in Thompson, working as a janitor at the hospital. He had aged terribly, decades of grief etched into every line of his face. When I showed him Samuel's photograph, he broke down completely. He told me that losing Samuel had destroyed his family. His wife had started drinking, unable to cope with the pain. She died in a house fire in 1984, passed out drunk with a cigarette still burning. His other children were scattered across the province, none of them in contact with each other. The removal of one child had shattered an entire family, created ripples of trauma that extended across generations. I tried to find out where the children had been sent after they were taken. The official records showed placements with foster families or group homes in southern Manitoba, but when I followed up on the addresses listed, none of them existed. I contacted the agencies supposedly responsible for the placements. Most had closed decades ago, their records lost or destroyed in fires or water damage or simple administrative negligence. It was as if these children had been deliberately erased, their existence scrubbed from official documentation. Then I found Dr. Ian Carmichael. He had been the medical director of a private psychiatric facility called Northwood Institute, located about 40 kilometers outside of Churchill. The facility operated from 1973 to 1987, ostensibly treating children with severe behavioral and developmental disorders. But Northwood Institute wasn't licensed by any provincial health authority. It wasn't subject to regular inspections or oversight. It was funded through a combination of private donations and government contracts, operating in a legal gray zone that allowed it to avoid accountability. I obtained employment records showing that the facility had a staff of 12 during its peak years. Dr. Carmichael, 2 other physicians, 5 nurses, and 4 orderlies. But there were also records of research assistants and volunteer observers from the University Pisamami of Manitoba's Department of Psychology. Between 1976 and 1982, over 200 children passed through Northwood Institute. Very few of them left. I contacted the University of Manitoba, asking about the research conducted at Northwood. I was told that any such research would have been conducted decades ago and that records from that era were not readily available. I filed a formal Freedom of Information request. 6 months later, I received a heavily redacted document showing that the university had received federal funding for cultural adaptation studies and indigenous behavioral modification research conducted at Northwood Institute between 1975 and 1983. The principal investigator was Dr. Ashford had published several papers in the late 1970s, arguing that Indigenous children needed to be removed from their primitive cultural contexts and reprogrammed to function in modern Canadian society. His research methodology involved isolating children from any contact with their native languages, cultural practices, or family members and subjecting them to intensive behavioral conditioning. He believed he was helping these children, saving them from what he saw as the inevitable dysfunction of Indigenous communities. He won awards for this work. He was celebrated as an innovator in child development theory. I found 3 former staff members from Northwood Institute who were willing to talk to me on condition of anonymity. What they described was horrific beyond comprehension. Children were punished for speaking their native languages, subjected to experimental medications without parental consent, kept in isolation for days or weeks at a time. Some were used in medical experiments testing new psychiatric drugs. Others were part of studies on cultural conditioning that involved deliberate psychological trauma designed to make them reject their indigenous identity. One nurse, who I'll call Anna, told me she quit after 6 months because she couldn't live with what she was witnessing. She described children who arrived at the facility healthy and vibrant, full of personality and life, and within weeks became withdrawn, fearful, broken. She talked about a little girl, about 5 years old, who cried for her mother every night until the staff started sedating her. Eventually, the girl stopped crying, stopped talking, stopped responding to any stimuli at all. Anna didn't know what happened to that girl. She was still there when Anna left in 1979. I submitted my findings to my supervisors at Manitoba Child and Family Services. I provided copies of the photographs, the case files, the research documents, the testimonies from families and former staff. I requested a formal investigation into the fate of the missing children. My supervisor, Director Patricia Langford, thanked me for my diligence and assured me that the matter would be reviewed by the appropriate authorities. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with Patricia and 2 representatives from the provincial government's legal department. They informed me that I had violated confidentiality agreements by accessing sealed files, that I had breached professional ethics by contacting families without authorization, and that I had created a potential liability for the department by making unsubstantiated allegations against former government employees. I was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full disciplinary review. I hired a lawyer, tried to fight the suspension. My lawyer advised me that I had virtually no chance of winning, that the government had unlimited resources to drag out the process, and that my career in social work was effectively over, regardless of the outcome. I tried to go public with the story. I contacted every major news organization in Canada. Most didn't respond. A few sent reporters who interviewed me and then never published anything. One journalist from the Winnipeg Free Press did write a story, but it was heavily edited and appeared on page 14 of the local section, framed as the ravings of a disgruntled former employee making wild claims about events from decades ago. The article mentioned that government officials had reviewed the allegations and found no evidence of wrongdoing. The families I had contacted were visited by RCMP officers who suggested that pursuing false allegations could result in charges of public mischief or defamation. Martha Kunuk was threatened with eviction from her subsidized housing. The message was clear: stay quiet or face consequences. I spent my life savings trying to force accountability. I filed complaints with the Manitoba Ombudsman, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I was told repeatedly that the incidents occurred too long ago, that the responsible parties were deceased or retired, that there was insufficient evidence to warrant further investigation. The photographs I had found mysteriously disappeared from evidence storage. The case files I had copied were deemed inadmissible because I had accessed them without proper authorization. Northwood Institute was demolished in 1991. The land was sold to a private developer who built a camping resort. Any physical evidence of what happened there is gone, buried under RV parking lots and vacation cabins. Dr. Ian Carmichael died in 2005 without ever facing any legal consequences. Dr. Kenneth Ashford retired with a full pension and published an autobiography celebrating his contributions to child psychology. The University of Manitoba issued a brief statement acknowledging that some past research practices did not meet contemporary ethical standards, but stopped short of any formal apology or accountability. I'm living on disability assistance now, diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety that makes it impossible for me to maintain regular employment. I've lost touch with most of my family and friends, who tired of hearing me talk about conspiracies and cover-ups. My former colleagues in social work won't return my calls. I've been effectively erased, just like those children were erased, but I still have copies of those photographs hidden in a safe deposit box in a bank in Winnipeg. I still have the testimonies I collected from families and former staff. I still have documentation showing that over 400 indigenous children were taken from their families in the Churchill area between 1975 and 1982, and that the vast majority of them have never been accounted for. If you worked at Northwood Institute, if you were involved in the child welfare system in northern Manitoba during this period, if you know what happened to Alana Kunuk, Samuel Nanook, Nayak Ipili, or any of the other children in those photographs, please come forward. These families deserve answers. These children deserve to be remembered. And the people responsible for this atrocity deserve to face justice, even if it's only the justice of historical truth. The unmarked graves at residential schools made headlines. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission documented the horrors of that system. But Northwood Institute and facilities like it operated outside that system, hidden from public view, erasing children without even the minimal documentation that residential schools maintained. How many other children disappeared into similar black holes? How many other families are still searching for answers? This story is far from over. The truth is still buried, but it's not gone. Somebody knows what happened. Somebody remembers. And maybe, if enough people demand answers, the silence can finally be broken. Story 3. The blood tests came back positive for arsenic, cadmium, lead, and thallium, levels so high that the lab technician called me directly, thinking there must have been a mistake. There was no mistake. I was looking at the biomarker profiles of 47 miners who had worked in the nickel-copper mines of Sudbury, Ontario, and every single one of them showed toxic metal concentrations that should have killed them years ago. Some of them were already dead. The rest were dying slowly, their organs shutting down one system at a time, while the mining company insisted the workplace was perfectly safe. The first victim I examined was Luis Alvarez, a 52-year-old drill operator who had worked for Consolidated Metals Corporation for 28 years. He collapsed at work on April 7, 2012, at approximately 3:15 p.m. while operating a pneumatic drill in Section D of the underground mine, roughly 1,200 meters below the surface. His co-workers reported that Luis had been complaining of severe headaches and blurred vision for weeks, but he kept working because he couldn't afford to take sick leave. He had a wife, Gabriela, and 3 children in university. Missing work meant missing mortgage payments. By the time the emergency response team got Luis to the surface and transported him to Health Sciences North Hospital, he was having seizures. The emergency physician, Dr. Olivia Grant, initially suspected a stroke, but the CT scan showed something far worse: massive brain swelling consistent with acute toxic encephalopathy. His liver enzymes were through the roof, his kidneys were failing, and his blood work showed he was essentially being poisoned from the inside out. I was called in to consult because of my specialization in occupational medicine and industrial toxicology. I had spent 15 years studying the health effects of mining operations, publishing papers on heavy metal exposure, testifying in workers' compensation cases. I thought I had seen everything the industry could throw at workers. I was wrong. Luis died on April 11, 2012, at 6:23 a.m. His brain had swollen so much that it compressed his brainstem, shutting down his respiratory system. He drowned in his own fluids, conscious and terrified until the very end. The hospital administrator, Frank Hutchinson, suggested that perhaps Luis had been exposed to something outside of work, maybe working on his car with toxic chemicals, maybe a pre-existing condition that had gone undiagnosed. Nobody wanted to suggest that the mine might be responsible, but I couldn't let it go. I requested permission from Gabriela to perform an autopsy. She agreed, desperate for answers about why her healthy husband had suddenly died. What I found in Luis's tissues was shocking. Heavy metal concentrations that indicated years of chronic exposure to industrial contamination. His lungs were filled with metallic particulates. His liver was scarred and failing. His kidneys were essentially non-functional. This wasn't acute exposure from a single incident. This was systematic poisoning over decades. I contacted Consolidated Metals Corporation and requested access to their workplace health and safety records. I wanted to see air quality monitoring data, exposure assessments, medical surveillance results for other workers in Luis's section. The company's safety director, Graham Holbrook, was polite but firm. He informed me that workplace records were confidential proprietary information and that the company had complied with all applicable health and safety regulations. He assured me that their operations were regularly inspected by the Ministry of Labor and that there had never been any citations for exposure violations. He implied that Luis's death was a personal tragedy but not a workplace safety issue. I reached out to Luis's co-workers, the other miners who worked in Section D. What I heard was disturbing. Multiple workers reported chronic health problems that they had been afraid to report officially. Persistent coughing, skin rashes, neurological symptoms like tremors and memory problems, kidney issues, liver problems. They were afraid that if they complained, they would be labeled as troublemakers and lose their jobs. Sudbury is a mining town. If you can't work in the mines, there aren't many other options. One miner, Yuri Volkov, agreed to meet with me privately. He told me that Section D had been experiencing ventilation problems for over 3 years. The air circulation system was inadequate, meaning that dust and chemical vapors from the blasting and drilling operations weren't being properly removed. Workers were breathing in concentrated heavy metal particles with every breath. Yuri had filed multiple complaints with his supervisor, Derek Paulson, but nothing was ever done. Derek told the workers that the company was looking into it and that they should just wear their respirators properly, but the respirators provided by the company were inadequate for the exposures they were facing. The filters were designed for standard mining dust, not for the specific combination of toxic metals present in Section D. And even those inadequate respirators weren't always available. Workers were told to share equipment to make do with filters that were past their replacement dates, to keep working even when the ventilation system was completely offline for maintenance. I convinced 9 of Luis's former co-workers to undergo comprehensive medical testing. All 9 showed elevated heavy metal levels in their blood and urine. 3 had kidney damage, 2 had liver disease, 4 had neurological symptoms, and all of them had respiratory problems. These men were being slowly poisoned, and they knew it, but they felt powerless to do anything about it. I compiled my findings into a detailed report and submitted it to the Ontario Ministry of Labor, requesting an immediate investigation into workplace conditions at Consolidated Metals Corporation. I provided medical evidence, worker testimonies, documentation of the company's failure to address known safety hazards. I expected swift action, inspections, citations, maybe even criminal charges for corporate negligence. Instead, I received a letter 6 weeks later informing me that the ministry had reviewed my concerns and had conducted a preliminary assessment of the workplace. The assessment found that the company was in compliance with all applicable regulations. The ventilation issues I mentioned had been addressed according to the company's documentation. The elevated heavy metal levels in workers could not be definitively linked to workplace exposure. The matter was considered closed. I was stunned. How could they dismiss such clear evidence? I requested copies of the inspection reports, the air quality measurements, the assessment methodology. I was told that some of the documents were confidential business information and could not be released. The documents that were provided showed perfunctory inspections that lasted less than 2 hours, conducted during day shift when the most hazardous operations weren't running, with air samples taken in locations far from Section D. I contacted the United Steelworkers Union, thinking they would be powerful advocates for their members' safety. The local union president, Richard Donnelly, seemed sympathetic at first. He agreed that workplace conditions needed to improve. But when I suggested organizing a formal complaint process or bringing media attention to the issue, he became evasive. He told me that the union had a constructive relationship with Consolidated Metals and that public confrontation would jeopardize ongoing negotiations over the next contract. He suggested that change needed to happen gradually, through proper channels, without making waves. I realized that everyone involved had reasons to downplay the problem, The company didn't want legal liability or regulatory scrutiny. The Ministry of Labor was understaffed and had cozy relationships with the mining industry they were supposed to regulate. The union didn't want to risk job security for their members by being too aggressive. The workers themselves were trapped between needing their paychecks and protecting their health. The only person without a stake in maintaining the status quo was me. So I went to the media. I contacted the Sudbury Star and spoke with an investigative journalist named Angela Morrison. She was genuinely interested and spent weeks researching the story, interviewing workers, reviewing documents I provided. It was front-page news, well-researched and damning. I thought, finally, there would be accountability. The reaction was swift and brutal. Consolidated Metals Corporation issued a statement denying all allegations, calling my research flawed and biased, and threatening legal action against anyone who continued to spread defamatory falsehoods about their operations. The Ministry of Labor issued a press release, standing by their assessment that the company was in compliance with all safety regulations. Richard Donnelly gave an interview saying that the union had confidence in the company's safety management and that the health problems I described were not representative of the general workforce. And then the attacks on me began. Consolidated Metals hired a private investigation firm to dig into my background. They found a malpractice lawsuit from 8 years earlier, a patient who had sued me for allegedly missing a cancer diagnosis. The case had been dismissed as without merit, but the company leaked the information to local media, implying that I was an incompetent doctor with a history of professional failures. They questioned my credentials, my methodology, my motives. They suggested I was seeking publicity or planning to testify as an expert witness in lawsuits for financial gain. I was called into a meeting with the dean, Dr. Philip Webster, who expressed concern about my involvement in controversial matters that could affect the school's relationships with industry partners. He strongly suggested that I focus on my teaching and research responsibilities and leave workplace investigations to government authorities. The workers I had tested started receiving visits from company representatives. They were told that participating in my study had violated company policy and their employment contracts. Several were transferred to different positions, effectively demotions. Yuri Volkov was fired for unrelated performance issues 3 months after speaking with me. The message to other workers was clear: cooperate with investigations and face retaliation. My funding sources dried up. Research grants I had been receiving from provincial health agencies were not renewed. Applications for new funding were rejected without explanation. Conference invitations were quietly withdrawn. I went from being a respected researcher to an academic pariah in less than 6 months. I was offered a modest severance package on the condition that I sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing me from making any public statements about my termination. I refused to sign. My severance was reduced to the legal minimum. I tried to continue my work independently, but without institutional support or funding, it was impossible. I couldn't access laboratory facilities for testing, couldn't afford to pay for medical examinations out of pocket, couldn't get published in academic journals without an institutional affiliation. I became a non-person in my own field. Luis Alvarez's widow, Gabriela, tried to file a wrongful death lawsuit against Consolidated Metals Corporation. Her lawyer, Simon Fraser, seemed confident initially. But after 6 months of legal wrangling, with the company deploying an army of corporate lawyers to fight every motion, every request for documents, every attempt to move the case forward, Simon advised Gabriela to accept a settlement. The company offered her $50,000 in exchange for dropping the lawsuit and signing a confidentiality agreement. She had 3 kids to support and mountains of debt from Luis's medical bills. She took the money. Section D of the mine is still operational. Workers are still being exposed to toxic heavy metals every day. The ventilation system has never been properly upgraded. The Ministry of Labor conducts perfunctory annual inspections that find no violations. Consolidated Metals Corporation continues to report record profits while their workers slowly poison themselves to earn a living. I now work as a freelance consultant, doing occasional expert witness work in workers' compensation cases in other provinces, far from Sudbury. I can't find permanent employment anywhere in Ontario. My reputation has been too thoroughly destroyed. My marriage fell apart under the stress. My wife, Elizabeth, couldn't understand why I was throwing away my career over what she saw as a losing battle. My children, Nathan and Claire, barely speak to me anymore. They're embarrassed by their father, the conspiracy theorist who lost everything chasing phantom injustices. But those heavy metal concentrations weren't phantoms. The damage to those workers' bodies wasn't imaginary. Luis Alvarez's death was real, and it was preventable. 4 more miners from Section D have died since 2012, all from cancers or organ failures consistent with chronic heavy metal poisoning. Their deaths were classified as unrelated to workplace exposure. Their families received no compensation beyond standard life insurance benefits. If you worked in Section D of Consolidated Metals Corporation's Sudbury operations between 2008 and the present, if you've experienced unexplained health problems, if you know about workplace safety violations that were covered up, please get yourself tested, document everything, and if you're willing to speak up, contact a lawyer outside of Sudbury who isn't tied to the mining industry. The statute of limitations hasn't run out yet for some of you. The mining industry has always treated workers as expendable. The only thing that's changed is they've gotten better at hiding the body count. But the evidence is still there, written in blood tests and autopsy reports and grieving families who know their loved ones were killed for corporate profit. Luis Alvarez deserved better. His family deserves justice, and the miners still working in Section D deserve to know the truth about what's being done to their bodies every single day they go underground. Story 4. The prescription record showed morphine sulfate. 200 milligrams intravenous push administered to a patient whose chart indicated a known opioid allergy. The dosage alone would have been questionable for palliative care. Given the allergy documentation, it was effectively a death sentence. Yet the attending physician had signed off on the order, the pharmacy had dispensed the medication, and a registered nurse had administered the injection. 37 minutes later, the patient was dead. Nobody questioned it. Nobody investigated. The patient's body was cremated within 48 hours. I was the director of pharmacy services at Hôpital Régional de Saint-Jérôme, a mid-sized hospital serving the Laurentians region of Quebec, about 60 kilometers north of Montreal. My job involved managing medication inventory, supervising pharmacy staff, ensuring compliance with drug safety protocols, and reviewing prescription patterns for quality assurance. It was that last responsibility that led me to discover what can only be described as a systematic program of medical murder disguised as end-of-life care. The patient's name was Etienne Laurier, and he was 68 years old when he died on June 4, 2015, at 11:47 p.m. His medical record indicated he had been admitted to the hospital 5 weeks earlier with pneumonia and had been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer during the workup for his respiratory symptoms. The cancer had metastasized to his liver and bones. His prognosis was poor, certainly, but his oncologist, Dr. Bernard Lefebvre, had estimated he had 6 to 8 months of remaining life, possibly longer with palliative chemotherapy and radiation to manage his pain. Etienne had been a high school history teacher for 42 years, beloved by generations of students. He was married to Adele for 45 years, had 3 adult children, 7 grandchildren. By all accounts, he was still mentally sharp, actively involved in planning his final months, determined to spend as much quality time with his family as possible. He had explicitly stated in his living will that he wanted aggressive palliative care to manage symptoms, but that he was not ready for medically assisted death. He wanted every possible day with his loved ones. Yet somehow, 5 weeks after his diagnosis, while his family was meeting with a social worker to discuss discharge planning and home hospice arrangements, Etienne received a lethal dose of morphine. The nurse who administered the injection, Suzanne Morin, documented in her notes that the patient was experiencing severe pain inadequately controlled by oral medications, and that the physician had ordered the IV morphine for comfort. When I reviewed the nursing notes from earlier that shift, there was no mention of inadequate pain control. In fact, Etienne had been chatting with visitors and eating lunch without apparent distress just 3 hours before the fatal injection. I might have dismissed it as a tragic medical error if it had been an isolated incident. But when I expanded my audit of medication records, I found a pattern that made my blood run cold. Over the past 18 months, 23 patients had died in the palliative care unit under circumstances remarkably similar to Etienne's case. Terminal diagnoses, sudden unexplained deteriorations, administration of unusually high doses of opioids or sedatives, deaths occurring within hours of those medications being given, rapid cremations, minimal family contact during the final hours. I pulled the complete medical records for all 23 patients. What I found was a systematic pattern of deception and falsification. In every case, the medical documentation had been carefully crafted to make the deaths appear natural and expected. But when I cross-referenced the pharmacy dispensing records with the nursing medication administration records with the physician orders, inconsistencies emerged. Medications had been administered that weren't properly ordered. Doses had been escalated without clinical justification. Allergies had been ignored. And in at least 7 cases, medications had been given that directly contradicted the patient's stated wishes in their advance directives. The physician most frequently involved in these cases was Dr. Antoine Vachon, director of the palliative care unit. Dr. Vachon had an impeccable reputation in the hospital and the broader medical community. He had been practicing palliative medicine for over 20 years, had published extensively on end-of-life care, served on ethics committees, won awards for compassionate patient care. He was exactly the kind of doctor you would want caring for your dying loved ones. Except that Dr. Vachon had a secret philosophy that I discovered documented in notes from ethics committee meetings stored in hospital archives. He believed that prolonging the dying process was cruel and that physicians had a moral obligation to ease the transition for terminally ill patients, even if that meant slightly accelerating the timeline. He had given multiple presentations arguing that aggressive symptom management should be the priority in palliative care, even if such management had the unintended consequence of hastening death. He spoke eloquently about dignity and suffering and the physician's duty to prevent needless pain. But what he was actually doing went far beyond palliative sedation or proper pain management. He was selecting patients who he deemed to be suffering unnecessarily, making unilateral decisions about when their lives should end, and then using his medical authority to carry out those decisions. And he wasn't working alone. Suzanne Mora, the nurse who had administered the fatal morphine to Etienne Laurier, had been working in the palliative care unit for 12 years. She was the nurse most frequently documented as giving the final doses of medication to patients who died suddenly. When I reviewed her work schedule against the dates of the suspicious deaths, she had been on duty for 19 of the 23 cases. The hospital pharmacist who dispensed the medications, Claude Giroux, had worked at the hospital for 15 years. He had a reputation for being accommodating, for finding ways to get physicians the medications they needed even when orders were somewhat irregular. He rarely questioned prescriptions from senior physicians like Dr. Vachon, trusting their clinical judgment implicitly. The 3 of them, doctor, nurse, pharmacist, formed a triangle of complicity. Dr. Vachon identified the patients and wrote the orders. Claude dispensed the medications without questioning dosages or checking for contraindications. Suzanne administered the lethal injections and documented them as appropriate palliative care. The system of checks and balances that should have prevented these deaths had been systematically circumvented. I brought my findings to the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Isabelle Marchand. I presented her with detailed documentation. The prescription records, the medication administration logs, the death certificates, the timeline of suspicious deaths. I expected shock, immediate action, possibly even a call to the police. Instead, 3 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with Dr. Marchand and the hospital's legal counsel, François Beaumont. François informed me that they had conducted a thorough review of my allegations and had found no evidence of improper conduct. Dr. Vachan's care had been consistent with accepted palliative medicine practices. The deaths I had identified were within the expected mortality rates for a palliative care unit. My concerns, while understandable given my lack of clinical training in end-of-life care, were based on a misunderstanding of how palliative sedation works. I was stunned. I pointed out the specific cases where medications had been given despite documented allergies, where doses exceeded established safety parameters, where patients' advance directives had been violated. François had answers for everything. The allergy documentation was old and possibly inaccurate. The doses were appropriate given the patient's tolerance levels and symptom severity. The advance directives were interpreted by the clinical team in light of the patient's actual suffering, which I, as a pharmacist, was not qualified to assess. I realized they were going to bury this. The hospital couldn't afford the scandal of admitting that a respected palliative care physician had been essentially euthanizing patients without proper consent. The legal liability would be enormous. The reputational damage would be catastrophic. It was easier to discredit my concerns and maintain the fiction that everything had been appropriate. I went to the Collège des Médecins du Québec, the regulatory body for physicians in the province. I filed a formal complaint against Dr. Vachon, providing all my documentation. 6 months later, I received a letter informing me that they had found no evidence of professional misconduct. Dr. Vachon's practices were consistent with established standards for palliative care. The college considered the matter closed. I contacted the families of the deceased patients. This was the hardest part. How do you tell a grieving daughter that her father's death might not have been natural? How do you explain to a widow that her husband might have been murdered? Most of the families didn't want to hear it. They had accepted their loved ones' deaths as inevitable, had moved through their grief, were trying to rebuild their lives. The idea that those deaths might have been hastened by the very physicians they trusted was too devastating to contemplate. But a few families listened. Adèle Laurier, Etienne's widow, was one of them. She had always felt something was wrong about how quickly Etienne had deteriorated in those final days. She had asked questions at the time, but had been reassured by Dr. Vachon that everything was normal, that the cancer had progressed faster than expected, that her husband had died peacefully. When I showed her the medication records, the documented morphine allergy, the timeline of events, she broke down. She had trusted the hospital to care for her husband, and they had killed him. Together with 4 other families, Adèle hired a lawyer and filed a civil lawsuit against the hospital, Dr. Vachon, and the other healthcare providers involved. The lawsuit alleged wrongful death, medical negligence, violation of patient autonomy, and systemic failures in medication safety. It was a strong case, supported by compelling documentation. The hospital responded with overwhelming legal force. They hired one of the most expensive law firms in Montreal, deployed multiple lawyers to fight every aspect of the case, buried the plaintiffs in discovery requests and procedural motions. The legal costs quickly became unsustainable for the families. Adèle alone spent over $200,000 in legal fees over 3 years. The other families dropped out of the lawsuit one by one as their resources were depleted. Meanwhile, I was facing retaliation at work. My performance reviews suddenly became critical, documenting minor issues that had never been mentioned before. My responsibilities were gradually reduced. I was excluded from meetings and decision-making processes. The message was clear. I was being pushed out. The termination letter cited multiple incidents of alleged insubordination and poor judgment. It was a complete fabrication, but I had no recourse. Quebec employment law strongly favors employers in termination cases. I consulted with several lawyers, all of whom told me that fighting the termination would be costly and unlikely to succeed. I tried to find another pharmacy position. My reputation had been thoroughly destroyed. Hospital administrators talked to each other. Nobody wanted to hire the whistleblower who had accused a respected physician of murdering patients. I eventually found work at a small community pharmacy in Trois-Rivières, a massive step down in both responsibility and compensation. My wife, Sophie, left me 6 months later. She couldn't handle the financial strain and the social ostracism that came with being married to someone viewed as a troublemaker. Adele Laurier's lawsuit was eventually settled out of court in 2019. The hospital paid her an undisclosed sum in exchange for a complete confidentiality agreement. She is legally prohibited from discussing the terms of the settlement or the circumstances of her husband's death. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing by the hospital or Dr. Vachon. Dr. Antoine Vachon is still practicing medicine at Hôpital Régional de Saint-Jérôme. He is still the director of the palliative care unit. He recently received a provincial award for excellence in end-of-life care. Suzanne Morin is still working as a nurse on the same unit. Claude Giroux retired in 2018 with full pension benefits and a plaque thanking him for his years of dedicated service. And patients continue to die in that palliative care unit, their deaths documented as natural and expected. Their families comforted by assurances that their loved ones receive compassionate care in their final hours. How many more Etienne Laurier have there been since I was fired? How many families have lost time with their dying loved ones because a physician decided unilaterally that it was time for them to go? Medical murder is the perfect crime. The victims are already dying. The killers have medical degrees and the authority to make life and death decisions. The deaths can be easily explained as natural progression of disease, and the system has too much invested in protecting its reputation to acknowledge when those deaths are actually homicides. If your loved one died at Hôpital Régional de Saint-Jérôme between 2014 and the present, particularly in the palliative care unit, you deserve to know the truth about their final hours. Request complete copies of their medical records. Look for unexplained changes in their condition. Question high doses of sedatives or opioids. Don't accept reassurances that everything was appropriate. Etienne Laurier and the other patients who died unnecessarily deserve to live out their natural lives, surrounded by loved ones, making their own choices about their final days. Instead, they were killed by people who believed they knew better, who played God with other people's lives, and who continue to practice medicine without ever facing consequences for what they've done. The truth is documented in medication records and death certificates and families' unanswered questions. Somebody needs to demand accountability. Somebody needs to stop this from continuing. Because it is continuing, right now, in that hospital, and nobody with the power to stop it seems to care. Story 5. The soil sample results showed benzene levels of 4,200 parts per million, over 4,000 times the acceptable residential safety limit. This wasn't naturally occurring contamination. This was industrial waste, deliberately dumped and then covered with a thin layer of topsoil and grass seed. And this toxic dump site wasn't some remote industrial zone. It was the foundation of Riverside Elementary School, where 374 children attended classes every day. I discovered the contamination on August 9, 2016, while conducting an environmental assessment for a proposed expansion of the school. I worked as an environmental consultant for Northern Alberta Engineering, a firm that specialized in soil testing, groundwater monitoring, and contamination remediation for oil industry sites. My job was supposed to be routine. Drill some test borings, collect soil samples, verify that the ground was suitable for building a new classroom wing. What I found instead was evidence of an environmental catastrophe that had been hidden for over 2 decades. The school had been built in 1994, during Fort McMurray's first big boom when the oil sands industry was exploding, and the town's population was growing faster than the infrastructure could keep up. There was desperate need for new schools, new housing, new everything. The land where Riverside Elementary was built had been purchased from Athabasca Energy Corporation, one of the major oil sands operators in the region, for what was described at the time as a generous donation to support community development. But that generous donation was actually a calculated move to offload land that the company knew was too contaminated for residential use. Internal documents that I later obtained through a former Athabasca Energy employee showed that the company had been using the site as an illegal dumping ground for drilling waste, produced water with high salinity and petrochemical contamination, and unused chemical additives from their extraction processes between 1988 and 1993. When regulations started tightening and enforcement improved, they needed to dispose of the evidence quickly and permanently. The most efficient solution was to donate the land for a public purpose, let someone else develop it, and hope that nobody ever tested the soil carefully enough to discover what was buried underneath. And for 22 years, that strategy worked perfectly. The school was built, children attended, nobody suspected anything was wrong. Until I started drilling test borings and immediately noticed that the soil didn't look right. There were chemical odors, unusual discoloration, unexpected layers that suggested fill material had been imported to cover something. I expanded the testing beyond what was strictly required for the project, drilling multiple additional borings across the entire school property. Every single sample came back showing massive contamination: benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heavy metals, including lead and arsenic. The entire 3-acre school site was sitting on a toxic waste dump. I immediately notified my supervisor at Northern Alberta Engineering, a man named Harold Mackenzie. Harold had been in the environmental consulting business for 30 years, had worked on hundreds of oil industry projects, was well connected with both corporate clients and government regulators. I expected him to be alarmed, to recognize the severity of what we had found. Instead, he seemed annoyed. Harold told me that I had exceeded the scope of work for the project, that the client hadn't authorized the additional testing I had conducted, and that I needed to focus on the specific area where the new construction was planned. When I pointed out that children were being exposed to carcinogenic chemicals every day they attended that school, he told me to calm down and that we needed to handle this appropriately through proper channels. I drafted a detailed report documenting all my findings and recommending immediate action: evacuate the school, conduct comprehensive contamination mapping, identify all responsible parties, develop a remediation plan, and provide medical screening for all children and staff who had been exposed. Harold reviewed my report and told me it was too alarmist and needed to be toned down. He edited my recommendations to suggest further investigation may be warranted rather than immediate action. I refused to sign the revised report. It was a lie, and I wouldn't put my professional seal on it. Harold submitted his own version of the report to the regional school board, who had contracted our firm to conduct the assessment. There was no mention of the thousands-fold exceedances of safety standards, no discussion of health risks to children, no recommendation to evacuate or remediate. I couldn't live with that. I contacted the school board directly, spoke with the facilities director, a woman named Christine Palmer. I provided her with copies of all my raw data and my original unedited report. I explained exactly what the contamination meant, what the health risks were, and what needed to be done immediately. Christine seemed genuinely concerned at first. She promised to bring the matter to the board's attention and to consult with public health authorities. 2 weeks later, I received a phone call from Christine informing me that the school board had received expert advice from another environmental consulting firm confirming that the contamination levels, while elevated, did not pose an immediate health risk to students or staff. The school would remain open while further assessment was conducted. She thanked me for my diligence, but suggested that sometimes non-specialists can misinterpret technical data. The other environmental consulting firm was Pinnacle Environmental Services, owned by Roger Clifton, who was on the board of directors of Athabasca Energy Corporation. The fix was in. The same company that had created the contamination had hired a consulting firm they controlled to provide a second opinion that downplayed the risks. And the school board, either through corruption or incompetence, was accepting that obviously biased assessment. I went to Alberta Environment and Parks, the provincial regulatory agency responsible for contaminated sites. I filed a formal complaint, provided all my documentation, demanded an investigation. The agency assigned an inspector, Daniel Kruger, who visited the site in October 2016. Daniel's inspection report acknowledged the contamination but concluded that it was historic and that the school buildings and paved surfaces provided adequate barriers to prevent exposure. He recommended long-term monitoring, but no immediate action. I couldn't believe what I was reading. How was pavement and old buildings an adequate barrier? Children played on the grass during recess, tracked soil into classrooms on their shoes, dug in the garden plots that teachers had created for science lessons. Staff parked cars on unpaved areas and walked through contaminated soil every day. The groundwater beneath the site was contaminated and potentially migrating. This wasn't a contained problem, it was an active exposure scenario. I contacted the pediatrician who served as school medical officer, Dr. Amira Hassan. I explained the situation and suggested that she might want to review health records for students at Riverside Elementary to see if there were elevated rates of leukemia, lymphoma, brain tumors, or other cancers associated with benzene exposure. Dr. Hassan was initially resistant, telling me that cancer rates in children are very low and that establishing causation is extremely difficult. But I persisted, and she eventually agreed to review aggregated health data. What she found was disturbing. Over the past 10 years, 7 students from Riverside Elementary had been diagnosed with childhood leukemia, a rate nearly 3 times higher than the provincial average. Another 4 students had brain tumors. 5 had severe developmental delays with no identified genetic cause. Multiple students had chronic respiratory problems and unexplained immune system dysfunction. Dr. Hassan was shaken by the patterns she was seeing. She raised her concerns with the Wood Buffalo Regional Health Authority, the local health department. They responded by commissioning a health study to determine whether there was a statistically significant cluster of disease associated with the school. The study was conducted by a public health researcher named Dr. Sir Kevin Braithwaite, who concluded that while cancer rates appeared elevated, the numbers were too small to establish statistical significance and that the observed cases could be within the range of normal variation. He recommended continued monitoring, but no intervention. I later discovered that Dr. Braithwaite had received over $2 million in research funding from oil industry sources over the previous 5 years. His research focused on community health in resource development regions and consistently found no evidence of health harms from oil industry operations. He was exactly the kind of researcher you would hire if you wanted a study that would protect corporate interests rather than public health. I went to the media. I contacted the Fort McMurray Today newspaper, the CBC, the Edmonton Journal, and provided them with all my documentation, the soil test results, the company's internal documents showing they knew about the contamination, the health data Dr. Hassan had compiled, the biased assessments from industry-connected consultants. I thought surely this would force action. The Fort McMurray Today ran a small article on page 7 describing concerns about historical contamination at a local school. The article quoted school board officials assuring parents that the situation was being monitored and that student safety was the top priority. My detailed evidence was reduced to vague allegations that were balanced against official denials. The CBC sent a reporter who interviewed me but never aired the story. When I followed up, I was told that their legal department had concerns about potential defamation claims. Parents started asking questions, demanding answers from the school board. The board responded with a community meeting on November 15, 2016, where the boy brought in Roger Clifton from Pinnacle Environmental Services to reassure everyone that the school was safe. Most parents seemed satisfied. A few remained skeptical but felt powerless to do anything. Harold Mackenzie told me that I had damaged the firm's reputation and violated professional ethics by speaking to media and public health officials about a project without client authorization. My professional engineering license was suspended pending an investigation by the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta. The APEGA investigation concluded that I had indeed violated professional standards by releasing confidential client information without authorization. My license was suspended for 1 year, with reinstatement conditional on completing ethics training and agreeing to stricter oversight of my professional activities. The suspension effectively ended my career. No engineering firm in Alberta would hire someone with a disciplinary record, especially someone known as a whistleblower who couldn't be trusted to stay quiet about inconvenient findings. I tried to organize parents to demand action. I helped form a group called Riverside Elementary Parents for Environmental Safety. We held meetings, circulated petitions, demanded that the school board conduct proper remediation or relocate students to a safe building. We filed a lawsuit seeking an injunction to close the school until the contamination was addressed. The lawsuit was dismissed for lack of standing. The judge ruled that the parents had not demonstrated imminent harm sufficient to justify the extraordinary remedy of closing a school. The school board responded to the pressure by conducting additional soil testing in the summer of 2017, this time using a third consulting firm that had no obvious ties to the oil industry. The new testing confirmed everything I had found. Massive contamination throughout the property, exceeding residential safety standards by factors of hundreds to thousands. Armed with this undeniable evidence, the parents' group renewed their demands for action. The school board announced in September 2017 that Riverside Elementary would undergo remediation activities while remaining operational. The remediation plan involved capping contaminated areas with clean soil and geotextile barriers, installing vapor barriers beneath buildings to prevent indoor air contamination, and restricting access to certain outdoor areas. The work would be done in phases over 3 years to minimize disruption to students. It was a half measure designed to manage liability without actually solving the problem. You can't cap your way out of contamination this severe. The chemicals would continue migrating through groundwater, the barriers would eventually degrade, and the fundamental problem, that children were attending school on top of a toxic waste dump, remained unaddressed. 2 families in the parents' group, the Johnsons and the Lees, refused to accept the inadequate response. They pulled their children out of Riverside Elementary and enrolled them in other schools, even though it meant longer commutes and disruption to their kids' education. Both families faced harassment from other parents who accused them of being paranoid and creating unnecessary fear. The Johnsons eventually left Fort McMurray entirely, unable to deal with the social ostracism. I moved to British Columbia in 2018, taking a job as a junior environmental technician at a small consulting firm in Kamloops, a massive step down from my previous career. My marriage didn't survive the stress and financial hardship. My wife, Diana, had warned me to let it go, to stop fighting battles I couldn't win. She was right about the outcome, but I still don't regret trying. Riverside Elementary is still operating today, still sitting on contaminated soil, still exposing children to carcinogenic chemicals every single day. The school board completed their inadequate remediation in 2020 and declared the problem solved. The province closed the file. The media moved on to other stories, and the families whose children developed cancer or developmental problems have no legal recourse because proving causation in individual cases is nearly impossible. Athabasca Energy Corporation was never held accountable for creating the contamination in the first place. They were never fined, never required to remediate, never publicly acknowledged their role. The statute of limitations for environmental violations had expired years before the contamination was discovered. They got away with poisoning children for decades, and they will never face any consequences. If your child attended Riverside Elementary School in Fort McMurray between 1994 and the present, you deserve to know that they were exposed to toxic chemicals at levels that significantly increased their lifetime cancer risk. You deserve to know that the contamination was documented, that authorities were notified, and that the decision was made to keep the school open anyway because closing it would have been too expensive and politically complicated. Document your children's health problems. Keep medical records. If they develop cancer or other serious illnesses, consult with lawyers who specialize in toxic tort litigation. The evidence exists. The corporate documents exist. Somebody needs to force accountability, even if it's years or decades after the fact. I sacrificed my career trying to protect those children. I lost my marriage, my professional reputation, my financial security. And the contamination is still there, still harming kids, while the people responsible live comfortable lives without ever being held to account. But the truth is documented. The soil test results don't lie, and maybe someday enough people will care enough to demand real justice for what was done to those children in that community. Story 6. The X-ray showed 6 broken ribs, a fractured skull, and internal bleeding consistent with severe blunt force trauma. But the discharge summary I was reviewing stated that the patient had been treated for minor injuries sustained in a fall and had been released from the emergency department after 2 hours of observation. The patient's name was Michael Running Bear, and he was a 29-year-old Ojibwe man from the Grassy Narrows First Nation. 3 days after his minor injuries, he was found dead in an alley behind the Lake of the Woods Brewery in Kenora, Ontario. I'm an emergency department physician, and I worked at Kenora General Hospital from 2011 to 2018. During those 7 years, I witnessed a pattern of medical negligence, racial discrimination, and systematic cover-ups that resulted in the deaths of Indigenous patients who should have survived if they had received proper care. When I tried to expose what was happening, I was destroyed professionally, personally, and financially. Michael Running Bear came into the emergency department on March 23, 2014, at approximately 9:30 p.m. According to the triage notes written by nurse Jennifer Walsh, Michael was brought in by police who found him intoxicated and injured near the downtown bus terminal. The police officers, Constables Peter Dalton and Aaron Simpson, told the triage nurse that Michael had been in a fight outside a bar, and that they suspected he was drunk and possibly on drugs. When I examined Michael, he was barely conscious, moaning in pain, with obvious facial trauma and difficulty breathing. His blood pressure was 88/52, dangerously low. His heart rate was 118, elevated, indicating shock. He had abrasions and bruising across his torso consistent with being kicked or beaten. This was not a minor injury from a bar fight. This was a man who had been severely assaulted and was in critical condition. I ordered an immediate CT scan of his head and chest, started IV fluids to stabilize his blood pressure, and called for a surgery consult because I suspected internal bleeding. The CT results confirmed my fears. Traumatic brain injury with subdural hematoma, 6 fractured ribs, punctured lung, grade 3 liver laceration, actively bleeding. Michael needed emergency surgery immediately to stop the internal bleeding, along with neurosurgical consultation for the brain injury. I called the general surgeon on call, Dr. Gordon Fleming. Doctor, when I confirmed the patient was Indigenous and had been brought in by police, Dr. Fleming sighed audibly and said, "Look, I'm in the middle of dinner with my family. This guy's probably going to die anyway." I was stunned. I explained that the patient would likely die within hours without surgical intervention. "Doctor, he refused to come in." I called the hospital administrator on duty, Shirley Kovacs, and explained that I had a critically ill patient who needed surgery and that the on-call surgeon was refusing to respond. I was desperate. I called the neurosurgery service at the Regional Trauma Center in Thunder Bay, over 400 kilometers away. The neurosurgeon I spoke with, Dr. Rachel Pinsky, said they would accept the patient for transfer, but that he needed to be stabilized first, and that transport by air ambulance would take at least 3 hours, given weather conditions that night. She emphasized that the patient needed immediate surgery and might not survive the transfer delay. While I was arranging the transfer, Michael's condition deteriorated. His blood pressure dropped to 72/40. He became unresponsive. I started a massive transfusion protocol, pumping blood products and fluids into him as fast as I could, trying to buy time until the air ambulance arrived. But without surgery to stop the bleeding, I was just watching him die slowly. At 11:47 p.m., Michael's heart stopped. We performed CPR for 43 minutes, but we couldn't get him back. I pronounced him dead at 12:30 a.m. on March 24, 2014. Cause of death: hemorrhagic shock secondary to traumatic liver laceration and hemothorax. A completely preventable death if he had received the surgery he needed within the first hour of arrival. I was devastated. I had failed to save a patient because the surgeon wouldn't come in to do his job. I filed a formal incident report with the hospital's Quality Assurance Department documenting exactly what had happened: the patient's critical injuries, my request for surgical consultation, Dr. Fleming's refusal to respond, the patient's subsequent death. I expected an investigation, accountability, possibly disciplinary action against Dr. Fleming. Instead, 3 days later, I was called into a meeting with the Chief of Staff, Dr. Leonard Pritchard, and the hospital's legal counsel, Martin Jessup. Martin informed me that my incident report had been reviewed and that there were significant concerns about my clinical judgment and documentation. He showed me the medical records for Michael Running Bear, which had been substantially altered since I had last seen them. My own assessment notes had been modified to remove references to low blood pressure and shock. The CT scan report still showed all the injuries, but had been supplemented with an addendum from Dr. Bell. The discharge summary stated that Michael had been admitted for observation and had then left against medical advice in the middle of the night. None of this was true. Michael had never been stable. He had never been admitted. He certainly hadn't left against medical advice. He had died in the emergency department after Dr. Fleming refused to operate. But the medical records now told a completely different story, one that absolved everyone of responsibility. I objected strenuously. I stated that the records had been falsified and that I would not be part of a cover-up. Dr. Martin suggested that if I continued to make unsubstantiated allegations about record falsification, I could face defamation lawsuits and professional discipline for making false statements about colleagues. I was trapped. If I pushed back, I would be sued and likely lose my medical license. If I stayed quiet, I would be complicit in covering up a preventable death. I chose to stay quiet, and that decision haunts me every single day. But Michael Running Bear wasn't an isolated case. As I paid more attention to how Indigenous patients were treated at Kenora General, I started seeing a pattern of neglect and discrimination that was systematic and pervasive. Indigenous patients waited longer to be seen in the emergency department, even when they had serious injuries. Their pain was consistently undertreated, with physicians assuming they were drug-seeking. Their symptoms were dismissed as alcohol-related even when they hadn't been drinking. And when they died or suffered serious complications from inadequate care, the deaths were blamed on their own or lifestyle choices, rather than medical negligence. I started keeping my own records, documenting cases where I believed Indigenous patients had received substandard care. Over the next 4 years, I documented 37 cases of significant neglect, including 8 deaths that I believe were preventable. I documented racist comments made by physicians and nurses. I recorded instances where medical records were altered to hide evidence of poor care. I collected data showing that Indigenous patients had significantly worse outcomes than non-Indigenous patients with similar conditions. In 2017, I presented my findings to the hospital's Medical Advisory Committee, thinking that perhaps a data-driven presentation would overcome the denial and racism that had prevented action in individual cases. I showed mortality statistics, treatment delay comparisons, pain medication prescribing patterns that showed clear racial disparities. I asked the committee to conduct a formal equity audit and implement training and oversight to address the obvious problems. The committee thanked me for my presentation and then did nothing. 3 months later, I received a letter from Dr. Here. I was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The investigation was conducted by an external consultant hired by the hospital, a retired physician named Dr. Wallace Hutchinson, who specialized in medical staff disputes. He recommended that I undergo remedial training in professionalism and communication skills as a condition of returning to work. I refused. I contacted the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario and filed complaints against multiple physicians at Kenora General, including Dr. Fleming, for refusing to treat Michael Running Bear, providing detailed documentation of the cases I had collected. They accepted the falsified medical records as accurate and dismissed my allegations as unsupported. I contacted the Ontario Human Rights Commission, filing a complaint about systemic racial discrimination in patient care at Kenora General. The commission declined to investigate, stating that their mandate was to address discrimination against employees, not quality of care issues for patients, and directing me to other oversight bodies. I went to the media. I contacted CBC's investigative journalism program, providing them with my documentation and offering to go on record about what I had witnessed. CBC spent 3 months investigating, interviewing other healthcare workers, reviewing records, visiting Kenora. They produced a powerful story that aired on the Fifth Estate in February 2018, documenting racial disparities in healthcare across Northern Ontario and featuring several cases from Kenora General, including Michael Running Bear's death. The hospital responded with a lawsuit against me for breach of confidentiality and defamation, seeking $5 million in damages. The lawsuit alleged that I had violated patient privacy by discussing cases with media without authorization and that I had made false statements that damaged the hospital's reputation. The legal costs of defending against the lawsuit would have bankrupted me. My lawyers negotiated a settlement. The hospital would drop the lawsuit if I resigned from my position, agreed never to work at any Ontario hospital again, and signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement preventing me from discussing anything related to my employment at Kenora General. I had no choice. I signed the agreement and walked away from medicine. I couldn't afford to fight. I couldn't risk losing everything. Michael Running Bear's family tried to file a wrongful death lawsuit but couldn't find a lawyer willing to take the case. Medical malpractice lawyers told them that the falsified records made it impossible to prove negligence and that going up against a hospital with unlimited legal resources was futile. The family gave up, unable to afford the fight. I now work as an administrator for a health non-profit in Toronto, far from Kenora. Far from the emergency department where I failed to save Michael and the dozens of other Indigenous patients who died because of racism disguised as medical judgment. My medical license is still active, but I'll never practice again. The non-disclosure agreement makes sure I can't testify in malpractice cases or speak publicly about specific incidents. But I can say this. Indigenous people continue to die in Canadian hospitals because of systemic racism that is denied, defended, and covered up by the institutions that are supposed to provide equal care to all patients. Michael Running Bear died because a surgeon didn't think an Indigenous man's life was worth interrupting his dinner. And when I tried to hold people accountable, I was destroyed while the people responsible for his death faced no consequences whatsoever. If you are Indigenous and you or a family member receives inadequate care at a Canadian hospital, document everything. Record conversations if possible. Get copies of all medical records immediately before they can be altered. Find lawyers and advocates who understand systemic racism and aren't intimidated by institutional power. And know that speaking up will likely cost you everything, but staying silent means nothing will ever change. Michael Running Bear deserved to live. His family deserved justice. And the hundreds of other Indigenous people who have died from medical neglect across Canada deserve to have their stories told, even when powerful institutions try to silence the truth. Story 7. The water sample I collected from the elementary school drinking fountain on May 15, 2018, showed E. coli counts of 1,600 colony-forming units per 100 milliliters, over 16 times the maximum acceptable level for drinking water. This was 18 years after the original Walkerton water crisis that killed 7 people and sickened thousands. 18 years after the public inquiry, the safety reforms, the promises that it would never happen again. And yet, here I was, staring at lab results, proving that children in Walkerton were drinking contaminated water every single day, while government officials and water utility managers insisted everything was safe. I worked as a water quality inspector for the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, assigned to the rural southwestern region that included Walkerton and surrounding communities. My job was to conduct compliance inspections of municipal water systems, review operational data, investigate complaints, and ensure that the hard-learned lessons from the 2000 Walkerton tragedy were being implemented consistently. The 2000 crisis happened because farm runoff containing E. coli contaminated a shallow well that supplied the town's drinking water, and the Public Utilities Commissioners, Stan Coble and his brother Frank, covered up positive bacteria tests and failed to properly chlorinate the water. 7 people died. Thousands got sick with bloody diarrhea and kidney failure, and the province implemented sweeping reforms to prevent it from ever happening again. Mandatory water testing by accredited labs, immediate notification of adverse results, provincial oversight of municipal systems, operator certification requirements. But by 2018, those reforms had been eroded. Budget cuts had reduced inspection frequency. Compliance monitoring had become a paperwork exercise rather than meaningful oversight. Water system operators faced pressure to minimize costs rather than prioritize safety. And the public had become complacent, believing that the tragedy was ancient history that couldn't possibly recur. I first became concerned about Walkerton's water system in March 2018 when I was reviewing monthly operational reports submitted by the Walkerton Public Utilities Commission. The chlorine residual levels, the amount of disinfectant maintained in the distribution system, were consistently at the low end of acceptable ranges, sometimes dropping below the regulatory minimum. This suggested that the operators were under-chlorinating to save money on chemicals or to reduce customer complaints about taste and odor. I contacted the utilities manager, Kyle Henderson, to discuss my concerns. He provided technical explanations that sounded plausible if you didn't look too closely. But I had been doing this job for 12 years, and my instincts told me something was wrong. I scheduled a compliance inspection for April 24, 2018. When I arrived at the water treatment plant, I found a facility that was technically functional but clearly underfunded and undermaintained. Equipment was old and showing signs of wear. Automated monitoring systems that should have been upgraded years ago were still in use, with manual workarounds when they malfunctioned. The operator on duty, Cameron Whitby, was competent but overworked, responsible for operating the treatment plant, maintaining the distribution system, and responding to service calls, often working alone with minimal backup. I reviewed the raw water quality data from the intake wells. Agricultural runoff was still a problem in the area, just as it had been in 2000. Bacterial counts in the raw water were elevated during spring runoff periods when manure from farms washed into groundwater. The treatment process was designed to remove these bacteria through chlorination, but only if the chlorine was applied at adequate doses and given sufficient contact time to kill the pathogens. The chlorination equipment showed signs of irregular maintenance. Flow meters used to control chemical dosing were out of calibration. The contact chamber where water was supposed to be held for at least 20 minutes to allow chlorine disinfection was short-circuiting, with water flowing through in as little as 8 minutes. These problems meant that even when adequate chlorine was being added, it wasn't effectively disinfecting the water. I wrote up my inspection findings and issued a notice of non-compliance, requiring the Utilities Commission to recalibrate equipment, repair the contact chamber baffling, and increase monitoring frequency. Kyle Henderson responded with a plan of action committing to address the issues within 90 days. I filed my report and moved on to other inspections, assuming the problems would be fixed. But in mid-May, I received a call from a parent in Walkerton, a woman named Laura Patterson, whose daughter Emma had been sick for 3 weeks with persistent diarrhea, stomach cramps, and fever. Laura had taken Emma to the doctor, who had diagnosed gastroenteritis and prescribed supportive care. But Emma wasn't getting better, and several other children at her school were sick with similar symptoms. Laura was worried that something environmental was making the kids sick, possibly the water. I told Laura that water quality testing was conducted regularly and that any problems would have been caught and addressed. But she was insistent, describing symptoms that sounded concerning for bacterial infection. I agreed to collect some samples from the school as a precaution, expecting to find nothing and reassure a worried parent. When the lab results came back showing high E. coli counts, I was shocked. This wasn't supposed to be possible. I immediately collected additional samples from multiple locations in Walkerton, homes, businesses, other schools, the distribution system. Of the 12 samples I collected on May 16th, 9 showed E. coli contamination ranging from 200 to 2,800 colony-forming units per 100 milliliters. The water supply was seriously contaminated, and people were drinking it every day. I issued an immediate drinking water advisory, notifying the medical officer of health, Dr. Stephanie Chung, and the Utilities Commission that the water was unsafe, and that residents should boil all water used for drinking, cooking, or brushing teeth. I expected swift action, public notifications, investigation into the source of contamination, emergency treatment measures. Instead, I encountered resistance and denial. Kyle Henderson insisted that the contamination must be due to isolated issues in the distribution system rather than a treatment failure. He suggested that perhaps construction work or pipe repairs had introduced bacteria locally, and that the problem would resolve on its own once the system flushed through. He pushed back against the drinking water advisory, arguing that it would cause unnecessary panic and economic harm to local businesses. Dr. Chung was more receptive but constrained by bureaucratic processes. She needed authorization from provincial public health officials to issue formal boil water notices and public warnings. She submitted a request for guidance, and we waited for a response while contaminated water continued flowing through taps. I escalated the issue to my supervisor at the ministry, Regional Director Thomas Cresswell. I provided all my data, explained the severity of the contamination, emphasized that we were facing a potential repeat of the 2000 crisis if we didn't act immediately. Thomas listened and then told me he needed to assess the situation and consult with legal counsel before deciding on next steps. Days passed. The drinking water advisory remained in place, but there was no public boil water order, no emergency response, no media coverage. The ministry was sitting on the information, apparently hoping the problem would resolve itself without the embarrassment of admitting that Walkerton's water was contaminated again after all the reforms and oversight that were supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. Meanwhile, people were getting sick. The public health unit started receiving reports of gastroenteritis cases increasing significantly above normal levels. Emma Patterson was hospitalized with hemolytic uremic syndrome, a potentially fatal complication of E. coli infection that causes kidney failure. She spent a week in intensive care at London Health Sciences Centre, receiving dialysis and blood transfusions, fighting for her life. 2 other children were hospitalized with similar symptoms. An elderly man named George Brennan died on May 29th from complications of E. coli infection. His death certificate listed the cause as acute renal failure due to enterohemorrhagic E. The source of his infection was never officially determined, but I knew. He had died drinking water that I knew was contaminated, water that should have been under a mandatory boil order, water that people were still consuming because the government was too afraid of bad publicity to admit there was a problem. On June 4th, 2018, the province finally issued a formal boil water advisory for Walkerton. The public explanation was that routine testing had identified bacterial contamination in the distribution system and that the advisory was on a precautionary measure, while the source of contamination was investigated. There was no mention that the contamination had been known for 3 weeks, no acknowledgement that people had been sickened and 1 person had died, No admission that I had been trying to force action while being blocked by bureaucratic cowardice. A team of ministry engineers and operators was sent to Walkerton to investigate and remediate the problem. They found exactly what I had identified in my April inspection: malfunctioning chlorination equipment, short-circuiting contact chambers, inadequate disinfection. They also found that one of the intake wells had high bacterial contamination from agricultural runoff and should have been taken offline until the raw water quality improved. Kyle Henderson had kept the well operating because taking it offline would have required using more expensive treated water from an interconnection with a neighboring system. The system was flushed, the equipment was repaired, the contaminated well was shut down, and chlorine residuals were increased throughout the distribution system. After 2 weeks of intensive treatment and monitoring, the water quality was restored to acceptable levels. The boil water advisory was lifted on June 18th. The crisis was over, at least officially, but the cover-up was just beginning. The ministry's investigation report, written by a senior engineer named Douglas Heatherton, concluded that the contamination had been caused by unexpected equipment malfunction and unforeseeable circumstances that couldn't have been predicted or prevented with routine oversight. There was no mention of the 3-week delay between my discovery of contamination and the issuance of the boil water advisory. There was no explanation of why the public hadn't been immediately warned when high E. coli counts were first detected. There was no accountability for the decisions that allowed people to keep drinking contaminated water while bureaucrats worried about public relations. I objected strenuously. I wrote a detailed minority report documenting the actual timeline of events, the decisions that had delayed protective action, the people who had gotten sick and died while the ministry hesitated. I submitted it through official channels, expecting it to be included in the investigation file. Instead, I was called into a meeting with Thomas Cresswell and the ministry's legal affairs director, Patricia Drummond. Patricia informed me that my minority report contained inaccurate characterizations and inappropriate speculation about motivations of ministry officials. She told me that including such a document in the investigation file would expose the ministry to potential liability in lawsuits from affected residents. She strongly advised me to withdraw the report. The official explanation was that I had violated ministry policies by collecting water samples without proper authorization, the samples that had discovered the contamination in the first place, and by issuing a drinking water advisory without supervisory approval, the action that had potentially saved lives by warning some residents not to drink the water. I hired a lawyer and filed a wrongful dismissal claim. My lawyer, Jessica Chen, was excellent, but she was fighting against government lawyers with unlimited resources and immunity from most employment standards that apply to private sector workers. The case dragged on for 2 years, costing me everything I had in legal fees. Eventually, Jessica advised me to accept a settlement, 6 months severance pay in exchange for withdrawing my claim and signing a non-disclosure agreement. I refused the NDA. I would take less money rather than be silenced. We negotiated a settlement that paid me 3 months severance without a confidentiality clause. It was barely enough to cover a fraction of my legal costs, but at least I could still tell the truth. Emma Patterson survived her kidney failure, but suffers from chronic health problems related to the damage caused by the E. coli infection. George Brennan's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Walkerton Public Utilities Commission and the province. The lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, with no admission of liability. Kyle Henderson was never disciplined. He continued serving as utilities manager until his retirement in 2021, at which point he received a plaque thanking him for his years of dedicated public service. Cameron Whitby, the overworked operator who had been trying to keep an underfunded system running with inadequate resources, was reprimanded for the equipment malfunctions and left the water industry entirely. The Ministry of the Environment issued a press release stating that the incident had been investigated, corrective actions had been implemented, and the water system was now operating safely. No mention of deaths or illnesses, no acknowledgement of the delayed response, No apology to the community that had been told their water was safe when it wasn't. I work now as a consultant for First Nations communities trying to address their chronic boil water advisories, helping them navigate the same government bureaucracies that failed Walkerton. It's meaningful work, but it doesn't erase the guilt of knowing that I discovered contaminated water, tried to protect people, and was stopped by officials more concerned about avoiding embarrassment than preventing illness and death. Walkerton's water is safe now, probably. The system is being monitored more carefully in the aftermath of the 2018 crisis that wasn't supposed to happen and wasn't officially acknowledged. But the same budget pressures, the same bureaucratic inertia, the same prioritization of cost savings over public safety continue to operate across Ontario and across Canada. If you live in a small town in rural Ontario, you should not assume your water is safe just because there hasn't been a boil water advisory recently. You should not trust that government inspectors are catching problems before people get sick. The system failed in 2000. Reforms were implemented, and it failed again in 2018. It will fail again unless there is fundamental change in how we prioritize public health over institutional reputation. Emma Patterson was 7 years old when she almost died from drinking contaminated water at school. She's a teenager now, dealing with chronic kidney disease that will affect her for the rest of her life. George Brennan was 73 when he died, looking forward to retirement and spending time with his grandchildren. They deserved better. Walkerton deserved better. And the next community facing a water contamination crisis deserves a government that acts immediately to protect people rather than covering up mistakes and punishing whistleblowers who try to force accountability. The truth is documented. The water test results exist. The timeline exists. And somewhere in ministry files, my minority report still exists, even if it was never officially acknowledged. Someday, maybe, someone will demand to see those documents and the cover-up will finally be exposed. Until then, the pattern continues. Contamination, denial, delayed response, cover-up, and no accountability for the officials who valued their careers and reputations more than the lives of the people they were supposed to protect.